Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 33rd episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Now, this is going to be a different kind of episode, one where we don't discuss a great of history, but rather the exact opposite, one of the worst rulers ever. It's a bit of a detour, but there's a reason for it. Actually, a few reasons. We've just concluded our multi-part series of episodes on the Roman general and politician Pompey Magnus, or Pompey the Great. He led an incredible life, reaching heights of Roman society attained by few people either before or after. He just got a little unlucky by being outshined by his contemporary, Julius Caesar. After spending so much time with Pompey, Rome is definitely on our mind, so to speak. So that's one reason. The second reason is the release of Gladiator II just this past weekend. So Rome is kind of on everyone's mind. The emperor featured in Gladiator, the first Gladiator, was Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, who ruled for 12 utterly disastrous years from 180 to 192 CE. Clearly, Gladiator is fiction, and it takes some liberties with historical events and people. But who cares? It's a brilliant movie and a great story of betrayal, justice, revenge. I've never been one to sneer at reimaginations of historical events because, well, what fun is that? I love Rome, and Gladiator took me there, took us all there. I say this to qualify my personal hang-up about one unanticipated outcome of the first Gladiator. One nit I've got to just poke at. Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal of Commodus was one of the most memorable parts of the movie. But Commodus was not the tortured schemer, maybe even portrayed as a brilliant tortured schemer, as he was portrayed in the movie. Commodus was a dull, violent, self-absorbed thug. As much as he is the central villain of the movie, people who have seen it think, kind of weirdly, more highly of Commodus than the real guy actually deserved. This isn't saying that Phoenix's Commodus was commendable. Far from it. It's just to say that the real guy was just that much worse. Commodus features in my book, Evil Roman Emperors, the shocking history of ancient Rome's most wicked rulers, from Caligula to Nero and more. The link to that is in the show description. That book was my attempt to identify the 10 worst rulers in Roman history. More than just emperors, the book explores a wide swath of Rome's rich history, including the semi-legendary kings of Rome, the period of oligarchic senatorial rule, and the imperial bodyguard called the Praetorians. I ended the book counting down from 10 to 1, and I don't want to give much away, but Commodus definitely takes a shot at the title, so to speak. That brings me, at last, to this episode. The emperors featured in Gladiator II are their brothers, Caracalla and Geta. They were the sons of the Emperor Septimius Severus, and the Severan dynasty is a subject of enduring fascination for me. On one hand, it gave us some of the most violent, wicked, and just plain strange emperors. On the other hand, the Severans also brought to the fore some of the most capable, intelligent, and cunning women in all of Roman history. I love the Severans. Well, as much as anyone can love them. You'll see. Now, I have not yet seen Gladiator II. I do not know how Caracalla and Geta are portrayed, but I do think that given our recent focus on Rome and the timing of that movie's release with where we are in this series, well, it's just all too much for us to not do something with Rome at its core. So, I'm going to take a page out of my own book. Literally, I'm going to cover Caracalla and Geta by drawing on evil Roman emperors. If they made it into that book, then you can probably guess that they're not going to get the epithet of the Great. Theirs is a wild story, one worth knowing. I'm sure that, like the first Gladiator, there will be elements of truth and elements of creative imagination in the portrayal of the co-emperor brothers as seen in Gladiator II. I have no idea if this contains spoilers because, again, I haven't seen it yet. But if you don't want to take any chances, then fair warning, you are about to get some of the details of the Severans. This will also bring us forward in time a bit. Pompey died in 48 BCE. Caracalla and Geta inherited the empire upon the death of their father in 211 CE. That's 2.5 centuries of Roman history that happened between these two milestones, and that time period was wild. The Republic collapsed, Caesar had unfettered power and was assassinated, the Julio-Claudians rose and fell as Rome's first emperors, an imperial dynasty, and on and on and on. Going over everything that happened would defeat the purpose of this episode, which is to have some fun and to get to know a bit more about Caracalla and Geta while they're on people's minds. But don't worry, when we resume the quote-unquote normal episodes and get to Constantine the Great, I will fill in a few of these blanks. Just know that by now, Rome was fully an empire, and the emperor had complete and total authority. Good emperors were benign and ruled with the interests of Romans guiding their policies. Bad emperors, well, became villains in Ridley Scott movies. Again, the link to the book is in the show description if you're so inclined, but regardless, let's get to know Caracalla and Geta. Or more precisely, let's start with their mother, because, after all, mother knows best. If these two boys weren't going to get along on their own, then maybe she was going to have to get them in line. Despite their father's deathbed advice, the two sons had done nothing but shout and argue with one another. Then they stopped talking to each other. Then they split the house in two and kept to their own sides. Then they started trying to kill one another. This was madness. Brothers shouldn't behave this way. And besides, these weren't two bratty little kids. They were the co-emperors of Rome. Unlike some of their predecessors, this family took their responsibilities as rulers seriously. How could they run an empire when they couldn't even run a household? This could not go on. Mom resolved to intervene. She called a peace conference to clear the air and find a way to get along going forward. They would share a meal in her apartments, just the three of them, no bodyguards or entourage, and critically, the boys were to come to dinner unarmed. Heeding their mother's call, the boys agreed to put aside their differences for one meal, and they made it their way to their mother's dining room. One brother went in good faith. The other did not. The older brother was Imperator Caesar Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus Augustus, but we will call him by his historical nickname, Caracalla. The younger brother was Imperator Caesar Publius Septimius Geta Augustus, but we will call him by the more concise Geta. One name was destined to be officially damned by the Roman government, excised from all buildings, scratched out from all documentation, obliterated by the ruthless efficiency of the state. The other name was to suffer a far worse fate, to be damned by history itself, cursed by hundreds of generations as belonging to one of the worst people ever to rule. The immediate cause of Mom's peace conferences was Caracalla's attempted assassination of Geta during the religious festival of Saturnalia. This plot was the culmination of the deteriorating relationship that was both bad for their life expectancies and bad for the business of running an empire. Certainly, the empire was big enough for both of them, right? As they gathered for dinner, Julia Domna sought reconciliation between her sons. Things had gotten bad. They'd quite literally divided the imperial palace in half. They barricaded the hallways from one half to the other and put detachments of troops to keep their respective sides safe from incursions. They were like two little kids arguing over an imaginary line in the backseat of a car. It was wholly undignified, behavior unbecoming Roman emperors. Julia Domna knew that the Roman Empire needed rulers focused on running the empire, not throwing daggers at one another. So the two boys put down their swords, dismissed their bodyguards, and headed to a nice family dinner. Isn't this great? Everyone here together. It was, of course, a trap. Calculating and ruthless, Caracalla saw in this dinner invitation a chance to off Geta once and for all. His soldiers burst into the dining room and rushed towards his brother. Julia Domna tried to shield her younger son from the assassins, but they had their orders, and they were going to carry them out. Geta was butchered in his mother's arms. Their work done, the soldiers left, and a weeping Julia Domna held Geta in her arms, his life ebbing away as his blood spread across her dining room floor. Caracalla made some feeble excuses about foiling a plot on his own life, and left the room, now the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. The family had come to power following the civil war kicked off by the Praetorian Guard's assassination of poor old Pertinax. The brothers' father, the statesman and general Septimius Severus, had seized power in 193 CE, a chaotic year known to history as the Year of the Five Emperors. When news of Pertinac's murder reached the Severus's military camp, his troops, and those of a few other generals, proclaimed Severus emperor. With their swords bolstering his claim, he marched to Rome, saw the current emperor, Didius Julianus, the guy who won the auction as referenced in the prior chapter. I left that in so you might have an incentive to go back and buy the book. And placed himself on the throne. Severus replaced the Praetorians with the troops local to him, deified Pertinax, added that emperor's name to his own, and marched back out to fight more battles. It took him a few years to consolidate power and finish off all the rival claimants to the throne. But by the time he did, he was left in sole command of an empire of enormous scale and complexity. It was a lot of work, and he needed help. He got a lot of this help from his second wife, Julia Domna, to whom he turned to advice and to think things through. After his first wife died of natural causes, Severus realized that he was in his 40s and had no kids. He had big aspirations, including ultimate prize of becoming emperor. But he didn't have the job yet, and he was childless. Given the dangers that came with being an emperor, after all, to be an emperor was just one crazed assassin away from becoming one of the gods, Severus knew he needed a legitimate heir or two as part of his imperial aspirations. He got word of a beauty in a far-off corner of the empire, whom soothsayers said was destined to marry a king. He traveled to meet this woman, proposed a marriage arrangement to her father, and the two got hitched. They made an exotic couple. Severus was African, the first Roman emperor born on that continent. Julia Domna was Syrian. Her father was the scion of a house of local royalty and the high priest of a Syrian mystery cult centered on worship of the sun god, Elagabal. Their marriage was a microcosm of the breadth and scope of the Roman Empire. Despite their wildly different origins, Severus valued and respected his wife, her advice, and her wisdom. She was a good partner to him. Severus and Julia Domna had a happy marriage, and as he figured out by now, came to have two sons who would grow up to hate one another. But Severus needed more than good advice from his wife. He needed to create legitimacy for his sons and heirs. His goal was not just to rule, but to found an imperial dynasty. He got more than he bargained for. In the year 198 CE, Severus made his older son Caracalla co-emperor. The lad was just 10 years old at the time. The idea was less about making Caracalla a true decision-maker and more about getting people used to the idea that one day he would be in charge. But Severus knew that the job of emperor was too much for any one person, as it would be for Caracalla when his time came. Accordingly, in 209 CE, Severus appointed Geta as a third co-emperor. When Severus eventually died, not one but two Severan sons would be on the throne. This did not sit well with Caracalla. Severus was constantly on campaign, marching his armies this way and that. Severus understood that the power of the empire lay not in the capital, not in the people, and certainly not in the Senate. No, the power of the emperor lay in the troops. Nothing else mattered. If you have an army, you have an empire. Everything else is just noise. And no mistaking, Severus had the army. He lavished praise and donatives on the troops. He honored them, and they honored him right back. With the army behind him, he could, more or less, do as he pleased, including, of course, condemning the uppity senators and replacing them with his own cronies. But Severus's government, while ruthless, was efficient and free from the brazen corruption of Commodus. As such, he was pretty popular with the people. Severus was developing a blueprint for imperial rule, and he did everything he could to teach his young sons the right way to do things. Under his firm, efficient, and autocratic rule, Severus pushed the Roman Empire to its largest extent. By the winter of 211 CE, he and his quarrelsome progeny were in Britain, warring against the Highland tribes and trying to claim the unconquered northern territories for the empire. Caracalla was growing tired of sharing rule with the old man. While riding out to meet his enemies and discuss terms on the battlefield, in plain sight of the whole army, Caracalla rode up to Severus, drew his sword, and made to assassinate his own father, who rode on in oblivion. People shouted warnings, and Severus spun his horse around in time to see his son's arm raised, sword in hand. Shamed by the eye contact, Caracalla lowered his sword. Back in camp, Severus called his son into his tent. He put a sword on the table between them and dared Caracalla to strike him down then and there. Caracalla didn't budge, but Severus strode away, satisfied that his eldest had been chastened. The reality was that the ever-calculating Caracalla knew that the old man was on his last legs. A life of near-constant campaigning had worn Severus down, and what Caracalla couldn't bring himself to finish, the cold British winter would. Aged and infirm, Severus retreated to his winter quarters in York and prepared for his death. As he lay dying, he called his sons to his bedside. He distilled his life's lessons down to 3 succinct pieces of advice: be harmonious, enrich the troops, scorn all other men. If you have family and soldiers on your side, nothing and no one else matters. Caracalla was pretty convinced that at least one of those things was actually not necessary. With Severus dead, the number of emperors went from 3 to 2. Each brother would have been content for that trend to continue as long as he was the last one standing. They hastily made a peace treaty with the tribes Severus had been fighting and pointed themselves south toward Rome. The two argued all the way back to the capital. They had very different personalities, ideas, styles, everything. They were oil and water, and capable of finding any common ground. At first, they decided just to split the empire. One would go east, the other would go west, and they would just stay the heck out of each other's way. Julia Domna realized that this would guarantee civil war, as it would only be a matter of time before the two led armies against one another. She talked them out of this scheme, but the infighting only accelerated. As Caracalla angled for ways to beat Cain to his brother's Abel, he considered how he might flex his new imperial muscles. He began to order executions almost right away, and the much maligned senatorial class, just beginning to regain its footing from Commodus's bloodshed a generation earlier, came straight into the crosshairs. The wave of death preceded Caracalla as he made his way into the capital. Senators weren't the only victims of this first purge. Caracalla had his own wife and father-in-law seized and executed. Keep in mind, she was the Empress of Rome, the first lady, and not to mention his second cousin. He was not safe to be around. Family ties meant nothing. All that mattered was his own power. As long as he had the troops as the finely honed steel point of his will, nobody could do anything to stop him. It took him no time at all to be feared by the nobility, which was good for him because he went out of his way to be feared. The one lesson he'd taken to heart from his father was to win the hearts and souls of the troops. He kept the cash flowing, and they never wavered in their support. Honor the troops, scorn all other men. And just as his dead wife demonstrated, he had no problem scorning women either. He ran into trouble when he perpetrated fratricide. Geta was the son of Severus too, and Severus had carefully promoted the brand and reputation of both of his sons. Both were loved by the troops. Besides, where Caracalla was dark and brooding, Geta was affable, a much nicer and more generous young man. People actually liked him. Granted, it's easier to be nice when you have the rest of your family to be ruthless, and Geta seems to have played up the difference between his brother and himself whenever he could. To the troops in their barracks, they had 2 great patrons, and many had strong affinity for Geta. When he died, these troops were nonplussed. They had sworn fealty to both emperors. One had been assassinated at the hands of the other. Just because Caracalla was left standing didn't mean that the troops were okay seeing the other son of Severus hacked to death. But how were they supposed to react? Some grumbled. Others kept their thoughts to themselves. The troops weren't the only ones put in a bad spot by Geta's murder. Like any young, charismatic politician, Geta had numerous followers and adherents in the capital and across the empire at large. They were furious at the loss of their beloved. Tens of thousands of Geta supporters expressed their outrage. With the troops restive and the people riotous, Caracalla was on thin ice. So he did the thing that every leader does in times of scandal. He lied. Caracalla claimed that he had been the victim. Geta, Caracalla claimed, had been trying to kill him. Caracalla only acted in self-defense. Praise the gods, his life had been spared at the last minute. The number of people buying this bald-faced lie? Exactly 0. Caracalla was a psychopath, but he wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't let the soldiers grow restive. Honor the troops. They were his base of power. Caracalla went to the barracks and told the men he had survived Geta's plot only by killing his brother in self-defense. There was a silver lining, he asserted. He said to them, quote, "Rejoice, fellow soldiers, for now I am in a position to do you even more favors," close quote. When a few troops started to speak, he cut them off and showered them with winning words and promises of riches and glory beyond their wildest dreams. If their loyalty was split before he entered the camp, it was now fully concentrated in his hands before he left. The army was his now, no matter how laughable his conspiracy theory was proving to be. More confident in his power, Caracalla stuck to his story. He forced the Senate to pass the decree of damnatio memoriae, which not so surprisingly means that one's memory is to be damned. Geta's name was to be erased from history. It was to be scratched out of official inscriptions. Any images of him were to be destroyed. Statues of him were to be smashed. To this day, visitors to Rome can see the results of this edict. In the Forum is the Arch of Septimius Severus, which he erected to laud the accomplishments of his family and to pave the way for his sons to rule. All references to Caracalla are intact, but any mention or likeness of Geta has been chiseled away. Gone, like he never existed. Except you can still see the scars in the marble. History is not changed so easily. Because Geta had been plotting to murder his brother, his death was justified. Accordingly, mourning was prohibited. Even his mother, in whose arms poor Geta had been killed, was not allowed to show any sadness. She had to go out in public and be seen as laughing and smiling, carrying on as though she had not a care in the world. Otherwise, as Caracalla made clear, she would meet the same fate as Geta. So to sum up the last few months, aside from the ho-hum, run-of-the-mill purges of senators and wealthy citizens, Caracalla had raised a sword to his father, had his wife and father-in-law killed, had his brother hacked to death in the arms of his mother, and threatened that poor woman with the steel of an assassin's sword if she didn't act happy enough for all the world to see. He was racking up quite a body count, and he was just getting started. As Caracalla promoted the lie of Geta's foiled plot, he thought he would try another page in the imperial playbook. He thought that maybe he could just start acting like a nice guy, just to see what happened. Caracalla went to the Senate, full of humility and contrition. In his speech, he declared an amnesty for all political opponents, granted pardons, and recalled disgraced citizens from exile. He lured as many people back to the capital as he could. This all was, of course, a ruse. Caracalla was biding for time, figuring out which people had been followers and supporters of Geta. He made his list. He didn't check it twice. Anyone he perceived to be naughty got sliced. Sorry. Caracalla's death squads had come to town. I really couldn't help it. Once he was ready, the killings began in earnest. Caracalla didn't care anymore whether people believed his lie. He drew a line in the sand. To have associated with him in any way, spoken positively of Geta or ill of Caracalla, or just generally been suspected of any of these things was to be marked for death. Caracalla ordered the bloodiest purge in Roman history. The killings swept across the city like a plague. Doors were broken down as innocent people were cut to pieces. Entire families were wiped out. The killing was indiscriminate. Men, women, young, elderly, hour after hour, day after day, death after death. The death toll was staggering. 20,000 people were killed in Caracalla's orgy of death. At this point, it would be fair to ask, why didn't some of the people just stay in exile? A quick glance at Roman history showed that recalled exiles usually didn't have too long to enjoy their newfound return to good graces, or for that matter, their lives. It seems that the call home was too much to resist. Caracalla didn't just order death. He sanctioned it as an instrument of terror for others to wield as well. He set out to prove to his praetorians that he meant it when he said they would enjoy his sole rule. He gave them a license to kill. They fanned out across the city, settling old scores and killing their own enemies. This was next-level stuff. It was one thing for an emperor to order the death of his own enemies, real or perceived. It was another entirely for the emperor to let his soldiers do as they wished and kill as they wished, no approval required. The one thing Caracalla didn't want to be called was a god. So many of his predecessors either projected divinity to cow the masses or to convince themselves that they were genuinely divine. Caracalla wasn't having any of it. He didn't want to be called a god, referred to as a god, or treated as a god. But this wasn't humility. He didn't want to be compared to gods because he didn't want to have to emulate their virtues. Even the strangest gods in the Roman pantheon had certain obligations to mankind. Caracalla was beholden to no man, and vice was a lot better than virtue. His justice had no rhyme or reason. He made it a habit of not having any habits, at least in terms of his decision-making. He did one thing one day, then contradicted himself the next. He changed his mind at the drop of a hat. no one ever knew what to expect. Everyone was liable to be rounded up and killed, both guilty and guiltless alike, according to Cassius Dio. Previous emperors, at least, had pretended that their victims had been guilty of something, even when the charges were absurd, far-fetched, farcical. At least there were charges. Caracalla skipped such formalities. A point, a nod, a whisper, and people were just murdered. As long as the fat cash bonuses kept coming in, the soldiers were happy to do his bidding. Life was cheap. Their loyalty was not, but it was paid in full. The soldiers loved him. His love of human bloodshed even spread to the arena. Where Commodus loved all kinds of spectacle, Caracalla cared not for the animal hunts. What he loved were the gladiators, not because of the life or death struggle, just the death. He reveled in watching gladiators die. In one example, a gladiator won, so Caracalla sent in another adversary. The man won again. Another adversary, another victory. Caracalla kept sending in opponents to face the stalwart champion until one finally cut him down. Aside from death, Caracalla's true obsession was Alexander the Great. He might not wanted to have been considered a god, but he let it be known that he wouldn't mind people suggesting that he was the reincarnation of the ancient world's greatest general. He emulated Alexander in every way he could think of. A historical rumor had it that Alexander's tutor, none other than Aristotle himself, you knew that because you've listened to this series, might have had a hand in plotting Alexander's death. Just to prove that absolutely no one was safe, the emperor had the school of Aristotelian philosophy suppressed and its adherents added to his hit list. Keep in mind, 500 years had passed and it was all hearsay. But in Caracalla's mind, time fell away and he was destined to walk in the footsteps of his long-dead hero. He set up a new army modeled on Alexander's, 16,000 strong, equipped them in period armor and trained them in period tactics. Never mind that half a millennia had passed and that weapons and tactics had evolved considerably. Caracalla could pretend that he was leading an ancient Macedonian army and with himself as the incarnate Alexander. In fact, to even be named Alexander was ground for imperial favor. Caracalla promoted men of the name through the ranks independent of any talent or ability. He didn't neglect his normal army either. He kept raising their pay. The imperial taxes went straight from the people to the soldiers. Caracalla gave them so much cash that he nearly bankrupted the empire in enriching the soldiers. But he had other ways to keep the cash flowing as well. Caracalla used his troops as an implement of terror all over the known world. Previous Roman emperors led campaigns for conquest and territorial expansion. Occasionally, Romans fought to prevent incursions from harassment or barbarians. Caracalla fought just to fight. He turned his army loose when and where he could, with express goal of raping and pillaging. Caracalla wanted his army to fight not for territory but for plunder. He kept them ravaging towns and villages wherever he could under any pretense. They destroyed everything in their path, an apocalyptic, insatiable horde of locusts growing fat and rich off the suffering of the innocents. To keep feeding the beast, he poured every cent he could into the army. He spent and spent and spent, every payment furthering their loyalty and tightening his grip on power. In 212 CE, Caracalla did the one thing historians mark as a positive for his reign. Roman citizenship was a complicated institution. It carried rights with regards to property, marriage, voting, legal protection in the courts, and the ability to hold public office. At first, only freeborn males from the city itself enjoyed the full benefits of citizenship, while anyone else got only partial benefits or none at all. As Rome expanded its powers, it fought wars with ostensible allies over whether or not to grant them full citizenship. Roman citizenship was worth fighting for. It was much better to be a full citizen than not. Eventually, as the empire projected to its greatest extent, it was a checkerboard of who had citizenship status and who didn't. With a stroke of the pen, Caracalla extended Roman citizenship to all freeborn males in the empire, and all freeborn women were granted the same legal rights as Roman women. Wherever they were and whatever their historical relationship with Rome, Caracalla extended the highest degree of legal rights and privileges to a wide swath of people living inside the empire. So nice of him to be inclusive and fair-minded, right? Wrong. Although the outcome of this edict strengthened the empire, his motive was purely self-serving. Roman citizens had to pay for all their rights through taxes. Caracalla wasn't celebrating Rome's great cultural and ethnic diversity. No, he was simply trying to increase the number of hardworking people he could fleece through his parasitic tax collectors. It all came down to pouring money back into the army. Caracalla didn't limit his extortion to tax schemes. He was constantly on the move, visiting the provinces, checking on the frontiers, crisscrossing the empire. Naturally, as emperor, he expected to be put up in style wherever he paid a visit. He checked his schedule, figured out where he would be staying and when, and ordered the locals to build elaborate, opulent houses and palaces for him. The locals, already bled dry by Caracalla's insatiable taxation, scrounged every cent they could and left themselves destitute to meet his demands. And then, he would be a no-show or just stop by very briefly. As if all this wasn't bad enough, he ordered towns to construct theaters, racetracks, and stadiums in towns where he might possibly spend the winter. They needed to be ready to entertain him. Then, he'd simply change his plans and order the buildings demolished, unused. If he wasn't going to enjoy them, then no one else was. He didn't just stop there. If, when scanning a map, Caracalla found blank spots in places he thought he might stop, he would order entire cities constructed. Of course, refusal or delay in building these houses, cities, places of entertainment was a certain death sentence. For Caracalla, these actions were less about the building projects and more about his projection of power onto the poor people who had no choice but to comply. Caracalla was a nasty guy. He wanted people to be scared. He fed off of fear. He deliberately wore a vicious expression on his face, practicing his scowl until he found the most menacing visage. The statues of him that survive are unlike any other empirical statues. Most portray emperors with a serene and wise gaze. Caracalla looks like he's trying to kill you. To be fair, if you lived back then he probably was trying to kill you. Like Commodus, Caracalla had no interest in intellectual pursuits. Unlike Commodus, he was intelligent and cunning, not dumb as a brick. But he had no interest in cultivating his mind. He was a soldier, or so he thought. He did everything he could to be beloved by the troops and to be seen as one of them. He shared in the hardships of camp, their meals, their rough living. To cement his place in the hearts and minds of the troop, he added his own comradeship to the big cash payments. The irony was that for all his camp bravado, he was a subpar general. He might have thought himself as one of the troops, but his poor decision-making and lack of tactical abilities unnecessarily endangered the lives of the men. Perhaps if he'd spent a little more time developing his brain, he might have been a better general. However, he eschewed all intellectual efforts and focused instead on his physique. In this way, he broke with his hero Alexander, who was insatiably curious about everything. With the absolute power of uncontested rule of the world's most powerful empire in his hands, whether or not he meant to, Caracalla skipped the preferable example of Alexander for the loathsome one of Commodus. He exercised frequently, building up his body. He put himself through vigorous workouts, honing his strength at every opportunity. We can almost imagine the obnoxious guy strutting around in the gym trying to intimidate everyone he sees. It didn't matter that he wasn't getting much done. Like Commodus, Caracalla didn't need to actually accomplish anything. He just needed to say that he did. He broadcast edicts to all corners of the empire proclaiming the runaway success of his administration. Actually, being good mattered less than simply being able to say it was so. He was an accomplished propagandist, but above all, Caracalla's true craft was death. He relied on tried and true ways to off people. Still, to simply say the name Geta was to be dead on the spot. One unlucky victim was the son of the dead emperor Pertinax. He made a clever but, in retrospect, highly costly quip about Caracalla's fratricide. It cost him his life. Caracalla's father, Septimius Severus, had deified and honored Pertinax. Caracalla murdered Pertinax's son. He could be awfully unimaginative, tossing out simple death sentences wherever he went. But he also found interesting and novel ways to condemn people. For example, if a magistrate was in ill health, Caracalla would, quote, promote him to a foreign posting in a climate that would hasten his demise. Commodus came back to haunt Caracalla. Literally. In 213 CE, Caracalla grew ill. In his stupor, he was taunted by visions of his dead predecessor. Commodus paid him a delirium-induced visit, in which the dead emperor told Caracalla to prepare for judgment before the gods. At about the same time, Caracalla seems to have become impotent. He vented his fury, one could say his impotent rage, in predictably awful ways. He accused some Vestal virgins, the sacred virgin priestesses, of adultery and had them buried alive. People entering brothels were killed, as were those accused of adultery or any sexual crimes. These were not moral punishments. Their true crime was being unable to act on their sexual impulses when Caracalla could not, to be able when the emperor was not. That was also a death sentence. Everything was a death sentence with this guy. People had to be very careful. Caracalla would tell his advisors and retainers to meet him before dawn, then keep them waiting all day. They were stuck. He would go off, doing whatever he pleased, while the administrators of the Roman Empire sat on their hands, wondering if this guy would ever show up. If they gave up and left the meeting place, and Caracalla suddenly appeared and found them gone, well, you know by now what likely fate awaited them. Caracalla went out of his way to humiliate Romans of high rank and responsibility and deliberately degraded traditional institutions. As the ranks thinned from his constant bloodletting, he replenished them, not with people of competence or experience, but with jugglers, petty merchants, and dancers. In 215 CE, Caracalla went to Alexandria, Egypt. It's impossible to overstate how important this port city was to the Romans. It funneled massive amounts of Egyptian grain to the empire and kept the Romans from starvation and rioting. This city was more than a conduit for grain. It was a wealthy, active port, generating huge volumes of commerce as well as artistic, religious, and an intellectual hub. It was very much the second city of Rome and one of the ancient world's most important cultural centers. The Alexandrians, like everyone else in the Roman world, were not fooled by Caracalla's claim of self-defense and the murder of Geta. They found these claims laughable, and so, naturally, they laughed. The Alexandrians mocked Caracalla's claim. His visit to Alexandria was not to pay respects to the second city of the empire. His true aim was much more sinister. Caracalla made a grand show of wanting to enroll the flower of Alexandrian youth in the Roman military juggernaut. His love and treatment of the troops was legend. Alexandrian families proudly rounded up their sons and presented them to Caracalla and his soldiers at the city walls. But rather than evaluate these young men for their lives and the service of the army, they were condemned to death at its hands. Seething over the city's mockery of him, even years earlier, Caracalla gave the nod and his army pounced on the unsuspecting youth. Heavily armed, veteran Roman soldiers rushed forward against defenseless, unarmed, naive young men. It was outright slaughter. The troops wielded their swords with apocalyptic precision. Thousands died in an instant. But if Caracalla's fury was not yet slaked, he then gave the order and his army was cut loose to savage the entire city. From the temple of the chief Alexandrian god, Serapis, Caracalla watched smugly as his troops desecrated the city, spreading rape, pillage, and slaughter to all corners. His troops stripped the walls of its wealth, piling up all the coins and riches into overflowing carts. They gathered more than they could carry. Rather than leave any money behind, lest the locals use it to try to fund recovery of the city, Caracalla had the leftovers burned, the coins melted down and rendered useless. As the fires his troops started were sweeping across the city founded by and named after his hero Alexander, Caracalla called these acts rites of purification, cloaking his profane acts with a sacred veneer. I doubt the Alexandrians felt much closer to the god. Well, those that were left. By the time his army hit the road and marched away, the city was in ruins, its people destitute, a whole generation of young men erased, and as many as 25,000 people dead. Caracalla seemed invincible. He was the sole undisputed master of the Roman Empire and one of the most powerful people who had ever lived. He had cowed anyone and everyone. No one dared to speak against him, even in the privacy of their own homes. To do so meant not only death for you, but for thousands of people around you. His army was an instrument of his will, his insane, violent, death-wielding will. They got paid two ways, from Caracalla's coffers and in the blood of their victims. The coins that fell into their outstretched, greedy hands were quite literally blood money. Caracalla projected his power everywhere. It radiated outward and in every direction. People averted their eyes when he came by. Fear was everywhere. Caracalla placed himself at the center of the ancient world's most powerful army. These troops loved and venerated him. He paid them. He honored them. He let them do whatever they want. His power seemed to be unlimited. Everyone obeyed. But one woman could still issue a command that Caracalla had to obey: Mother Nature. When you're in the constant company of someone who is a genocidal maniac, it doesn't take half a brain to realize that your time could come at any moment. To kill such a maniac could be a proactive act of self-preservation. And that is how one of the bloodiest tyrants in Roman history met his long overdue end. The head of Caracalla's imperial bodyguard, Macrinus, got word that he might be next on the hit list. Resolving to act before Caracalla could give the word, Macrinus recruited a few conspirators and enacted his scheme. How do you kill an emperor who is surrounded by tens of thousands of fiercely loyal, violent, and ruthless soldiers? You wait for one of the few times when he would be all alone and vulnerable, if only for a few seconds. While Caracalla was marching from one place to the next, he stopped to answer nature's call. Ordering his rumbling army to take a brief pause, the emperor went down the road a few strides for a little privacy and started to relieve himself. Capitalizing on this brief moment of vulnerability, an assassin stabbed the emperor. He bled to death on the road. He was 29 years old and had ruled solo for just 6 years. What's to make of Caracalla's life and career? Clearly, he was a murderous lunatic who brought a reign of terror upon Rome, its enemies and allies alike. Plenty of emperors had been pretty loose with orders to kill, but Caracalla took this to a whole new level. Never before had death been so systematized. As long as the money kept flowing, his troops were more than happy to do his psychopathic bidding. He was obsessed with his own power, and those whom he didn't kill he sought to humiliate. His treatment of the people, even of whole cities, ushered in a new low bar for degradation of the dignity of Roman institutions. He was as unpopular with the nobility as he was popular with the soldiers. They were, as one might imagine, furious at having their patron assassinated and the spigot of blood money turned off. As will be seen in upcoming chapters, their loyalty to Caracalla would extend even in death. There would be grave consequences for his successor, an opportunity to manipulate the troops' anger to the advantage of one cunning noblewoman, and the entrance to the stage of one of the weirdest and worst people ever to rule. So there you have it. Thank you for listening to this episode. I'm grateful that you did. I hope you enjoyed this little diversion from the theme of this series. Maybe to appreciate greatness, or at least why some people can be considered to be great, it's helpful to remind ourselves of the opposite, what genuinely terrible people did and how they exercised unfettered power. So now we will do what I promised at the end of the Pompey episodes. Dive into the dramatic and controversial life of one of history's great villains and explore just how much of his reputation is earned and how much is just propaganda. So again, join us as we explore the brilliant life and violent times of Herod the Great.